The command center of the Zetharian Galactic Empire stretched across 3 miles of polished metal and glowing screens. Emperor Vornthax stood at the center platform with his forearms crossed behind his back as he looked out at the Grand Council. The council consisted of representatives from 400 different civilizations, and each one of them had bent the knee to Zetharian power over the past 1,000 years. Today, the Emperor had called them together for an announcement that would add another world to their collection. The holographic display showed a small blue planet rotating slowly in the darkness of space. It was the third planet from a yellow star in a quiet arm of an unremarkable galaxy. The Emperor's scouts had spent 3 months watching this world and studying its inhabitants. The creatures called themselves humans, and they lived on a planet they named Earth. From what the scouts could see, these humans were barely capable of leaving their own atmosphere. They used primitive chemical rockets that burned fuel just to escape their gravity well. Their weapons were crude explosives and simple nuclear devices. Their cities had no shields, and their orbital presence was laughable. Emperor Vornthax raised one of his primary arms and the room fell silent. His voice boomed across the chamber as he spoke in the ancient language of conquest. The translation systems carried his words to every species present. He told them that Earth would be the next addition to the Empire. The humans had resources that the Empire needed, and their planet occupied a strategic position near several important trade routes. More importantly, the Emperor said the humans were weak, and their conquest would be swift and easy. It would serve as a reminder to the other civilizations in the galaxy that Zetharian power was absolute and unchallengeable. The council members nodded and clicked and hummed their approval. None of them dared to question the Emperor's decision. The Zetharians had never lost a war, and their military might was legendary. Their fleet consisted of warships that stretched 4 kilometers and carried weapons that could crack planets. They had conquered 97 civilizations before this, and each conquest had been easier than the last. The humans would be number 98, and the campaign would probably be over in a matter of days. Meanwhile on Earth, in a facility buried deep under the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, a man named Jake Morrison sat at his workstation monitoring deep space telemetry. Jake was a commander in the United Earth Defense Network, and his job was to watch for signals from beyond the solar system. For most of his career, this had been quiet work. Earth's radio telescopes picked up natural cosmic radiation and occasional pulses from distant stars, but nothing that indicated intelligent life. Tonight, however, was different. The screens in front of Jake suddenly lit up with activity as an unusual transmission came through on multiple frequencies. Jake leaned forward and adjusted his headset as the computers began analyzing the signal. It was clearly artificial and incredibly powerful. The transmission was being broadcast across hundreds of channels simultaneously, and it contained structured data that the computers recognized as language. Within seconds, the translation algorithms kicked in, and text began appearing on Jake's screen. The message was being sent in 17 different languages, including flawless English. Jake felt his stomach tighten as he read the words. The message was a declaration of war. It stated that the Zetharian Galactic Empire had judged humanity and found them suitable for conquest. The humans were given 7 Earth days to surrender unconditionally. If they refused, then the Zetharian fleet would arrive and take the planet by force. All human governments would be dissolved. All military forces would be eliminated. The surviving population would be placed under imperial control. Resistance would result in the complete destruction of Earth's major cities. The message ended with coordinates for where human leaders should send their surrender. Jake immediately hit the emergency alert button. Red lights began flashing throughout the facility as alarms sounded. Within minutes, the entire command center was fully staffed. General Danny Pierce arrived and read the message himself. His face remained calm, but Jake could see the tension in his jaw. The general ordered immediate verification of the signal and confirmation that this wasn't some elaborate hoax. The technical teams worked quickly, and within an hour, they had their answer. The transmission was real. It had originated from beyond the solar system. It carried power signatures that were clearly not human. Earth had just received its first communication from an alien civilization, and it was a threat of total annihilation. The president of the United States was Helen Carter, and she received the call at 3 in the morning. By dawn, she had convened an emergency meeting with the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the leaders of every major nation on Earth. The meeting took place in a secure bunker beneath Washington, where the world's most powerful people gathered around a long table. The alien message was played for everyone present. Some of the leaders looked terrified, while others looked skeptical. A few demanded to know if this was some kind of test or psychological operation. Defense. Secretary Ben Hughes was the first to speak after the message ended. He recommended a measured response. Perhaps the aliens could be reasoned with, or perhaps they were simply testing humanity's reaction. He suggested attempting diplomatic communication before assuming the worst. Several other officials agreed with him. They argued that any species capable of crossing the stars must be intelligent enough to negotiate. Admiral Lisa Brennan disagreed. She commanded Space Command, which was officially in charge of Earth's orbital defense network and satellite systems. She stood up and placed her hands on the table as she spoke. Her voice was steady and cold. She said that humanity should send a simple reply declining the alien ultimatum. Nothing more and nothing less. Several people in the room looked at her like she had lost her mind. One general asked what military assets Earth could possibly use against an interstellar empire. Another pointed out that humanity had barely established a permanent presence on the moon, let alone developed weapons that could fight in deep space. Admiral Brennan smiled but said nothing more. President Carter studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. The president ordered that a response be drafted. It would be polite but firm. Earth would not surrender. The meeting was adjourned, and the world leaders returned to their nations to prepare their people. Within hours, the news networks had the story. The alien message was played on every channel. Cities erupted in panic as people fled to the countryside. Store shelves were emptied. Highways became parking lots. The governments tried to maintain order, but fear spread faster than any official statement. What none of the panicking civilians knew was that their leaders were not nearly as worried as they appeared. What the Zetharian scouts had not discovered during their 3 months of observation was that everything they saw was a carefully maintained illusion. The primitive rockets and simple satellites were real, but they were not the extent of human capabilities. They were merely props in a stage play that humanity had been performing for over 60 years. Ever since the first detection of alien signals in the 1960s, Earth's greatest minds had been working in absolute secrecy. They had built weapons and ships and defenses that the public never knew existed. The truth was that humanity had been preparing for this exact moment for 3 generations, and now the Zetharians had just made the greatest mistake in their empire's 1,000-year history. General Danny Pierce walked through the underground corridor that stretched 4 miles beneath the Nevada desert. The walls were smooth concrete, and the lighting was harsh white. Every 100 feet there were armed guards standing at attention. These soldiers wore uniforms that no civilian had ever seen and carried weapons that did not officially exist. Danny had spent 30 years in the military, and the last 15 had been devoted entirely to this moment. He reached a massive steel door that required 3 different security checks, including a retinal scan and DNA verification. The door opened with a hiss of pressurized air. Beyond the door was a command center that rivaled anything seen in science fiction movies. Hundreds of people sat at workstations monitoring screens that showed data streaming in from across the solar system. Holographic displays floated in the air, showing ship positions and weapon status reports. Danny walked to the central platform where Admiral Lisa Brennan was already waiting. She looked up at him and nodded once. The activation order had been given by the president 30 minutes ago. And now it was time to show the world what humanity had really been building. Danny entered his authorization code into the main console. Across the planet, similar codes were being entered in 6 other facilities. In the Australian outback, a hidden base powered up its reactors. In the Amazon rainforest, massive doors concealed by decades of jungle growth began to open. In Antarctica, beneath 2 miles of ice, an entire complex came online. In the Sahara Desert, under centuries of sand excavation machinery rolled aside, On the dark side of the moon, inside craters that looked natural from orbit hangar doors retracted. In the Kuiper Belt, far beyond Pluto, where the public believed humanity had never sent a single probe, there were installations that had been operational for 20 years. The screens in the command center updated as each facility reported ready status. Admiral Brennan walked to the main holographic display and expanded it to show the entire solar system. Thousands of red dots appeared, representing human vessels that were powering up their reactors. Some were small fighter craft no bigger than a bus. Others were massive battleships that stretched for 3 kilometers. All of them had been built in secret. All of them had been crewed and maintained by military personnel who had signed secrecy oaths that carried life. Imprisonment for violation. The official story was that Earth had 12 functional spacecraft, including the International Space Station and a few research vessels. The truth was that humanity had 43,000 combat-ready warships. Dr. Amy Foster arrived at the command center carrying a tablet computer. She was the chief scientist of the Advanced Weapons Division, and she had been summoned to brief the president on humanity's actual capabilities. Amy was 52 years old and had spent her entire adult life working on classified projects. She had 3 doctoral degrees in physics and had personally designed some of the weapon systems that were about to be revealed. A military transport was waiting to take her to Washington, but first she needed to review the latest status reports with Danny and Lisa. The 3 of them stood around the holographic display as Amy swiped through data on her tablet. She explained that all primary weapon systems were operational. The antimatter torpedoes were loaded and ready. The quantum shield generators were at full power. The nanite swarm launchers were armed. The kinetic artillery was calibrated. Every single weapons platform that Earth had placed in orbit over the past 60 years was now active, and targeting solutions were being calculated. The Zetherians had given humanity 7 days, but Amy said they would not need 7 hours once the enemy fleet arrived. Danny asked about the faster-than-light drives. This was the technology that humanity was most proud of and most careful to conceal. The public believed that faster-than-light travel was impossible, and that Einstein's theories prevented anything from exceeding the speed of light. The truth was that human scientists had cracked the problem 20 years ago using quantum field manipulation. Every major warship in the fleet could cross the distance from Earth to Neptune in under 4 minutes. They could accelerate to speeds that would take them to the nearest star system in 3 days. The Zetherians still used hyperspace tunnels, which were predictable and slow by comparison. Amy confirmed that all FTL drives were functioning perfectly. She also mentioned that the stealth systems were operating beyond expectations. The Zetherian scouts had been watching Earth for 3 months and had not detected a single hidden vessel. This was because human ships used quantum displacement fields that bent light and radiation around their hulls. To any sensor, they simply did not exist. The technology was so effective that even other human ships needed special transponders to detect friendly vessels. While the 3 officers discussed technical details, the Zetherian fleet was crossing the empty space between galaxies. 3,000 warships moved in formation with Emperor Vornthak's S flagship at the center. Fleet Admiral Korvax stood on the bridge of the flagship reviewing the final attack plans. He was a veteran of 42 conquest campaigns, and he had never lost a single battle. The humans would be no different than the dozens of other primitive species he had crushed. His tactical officers had already calculated the optimal firing solutions for Earth's major population centers. Once they arrived, they would demonstrate their power by destroying one city. After that, the humans would surrender immediately. The Zetherian crew was relaxed and confident. Some of them were gambling on how long the humans would resist. The popular bet was less than 6 hours from first contact to complete surrender. A few optimistic soldiers bet on 3 hours. One young officer who had never seen combat suggested that the humans might fight for a full day. The others laughed at him. The weapons officer was reviewing targeting data for a city called New York. It had a population of 8 million, and its destruction would send the perfect message. He looked forward to watching the plasma cannons turn the city into glass. Captain Ryan Wells sat in the command chair of the human vessel, Defiant. His ship was positioned near Neptune's orbit, with its stealth systems engaged. The Defiant was a destroyer-class vessel, measuring 800 meters long and carrying a crew of 200. Ryan had commanded her for 3 years, and his crew was among the best in the fleet. They had run combat drills every week for those 3 years. They had trained against simulated enemy vessels using tactical data gathered from 60 years of listening. 2 alien communications. They knew Zetharian weapons capabilities and shield frequencies and tactical doctrines better than the Etherians themselves. Ryan's tactical officer was a woman named Kate Simmons. She sat at the sensor station monitoring the approach of the Zetharian fleet. The enemy was still 2 days away at their current speed. Kate had been tracking their communications since they entered the solar system. The Zetharians were not being careful about their broadcasts. They assumed no one was listening, or that even if someone was listening, the primitive humans would not be able to decode their language. Kate spoke 14 alien languages, and Zetharian was one of the easiest. She had been recording every conversation, and what she heard made her angry. The Zetharian soldiers were joking about which human cities they would destroy first. They were debating whether humans would make good slaves or if they were only suitable for extermination. They were laughing about the primitive chemical rockets they had observed. One Zetharian officer made a crude joke about keeping some human females as trophies. Kate recorded it all without expression. She had learned long ago not to let emotion interfere with her work. There would be time for emotion later. Right now, she had a job to do. Ryan watched his crew work with quiet pride. Every person on the Defiant knew what was coming. They had families back on Earth who believed they worked for a satellite monitoring company. Those families were currently terrified because they thought Earth was defenseless against an alien invasion. Ryan wished he could tell them the truth, but operational security was absolute. In a few days, the secret would be revealed, but until then, he and his crew had to maintain the illusion. His orders were simple, and he had them memorized. Observe the enemy fleet. Track their movements. Wait for the attack order. When that order came, Ryan would have the honor of firing the first shot in humanity's response, and he intended to make it count. The 7 days passed slowly for the people of Earth. Cities remained in chaos as millions of people tried to flee to what they thought would be safer locations. Governments worked around the clock to maintain order, but panic had taken hold. Store shelves stayed empty. Gas stations ran dry. Schools closed and businesses shuttered their doors. In homes across the planet, families huddled together watching news broadcasts that showed nothing but speculation and fear. Religious leaders offered prayers. Scientists gave interviews explaining how hopeless Earth's situation appeared. Military analysts on television discussed the impossibility of fighting an interstellar empire with primitive rockets and nuclear weapons. What none of these people knew was that deep and secure facilities around the world, military commanders were actually quite calm. General Danny Pierce spent the 7 days reviewing attack plans and coordinating with fleet commanders. Admiral Lisa Brennan conducted final readiness drills with ship crews. Dr. Amy Foster ran last-minute diagnostics on weapon systems. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plans that had been developed over decades. The public panic was unfortunate, but necessary. If humanity appeared too confident, the Zetharians might suspect something was wrong. On the 7th day, the deadline expired at exactly 1200 hours Universal Time. In the command center beneath Colorado, every screen showed the same countdown timer reaching 0. The room fell silent as the moment arrived. Jake Morrison sat at his station monitoring the Zetharian fleet, which had now reached the orbit of Jupiter. The alien formation had spread out into an attack pattern. 3,000 warships arranged in groups of 100. Their weapons were charging. Their shields were up. They were preparing for an easy victory. Emperor Vornthax sat on his throne aboard the flagship, watching holographic displays that showed the primitive Earth growing larger. He felt satisfaction knowing that in a few hours, another world would belong to the Empire. His military advisors stood nearby discussing which cities to destroy first. They had decided to eliminate 10 major population centers as an opening strike. New York and London and Tokyo and Beijing and Moscow and Mumbai and Snow, Polo and Lagos and Sydney and Mexico City would all burn simultaneously. After that, the humans would have no choice but to surrender. The Emperor ordered his communications officer to send one final message to Earth. The officer complied, and the transmission was broadcast across all human frequencies. The message was brief and contemptuous. It stated that humanity's silence had been interpreted as surrender. The Zetharian fleet would now proceed with occupation. Human military forces were ordered to stand down. Human leaders were ordered to prepare for processing. Any resistance would result in the immediate destruction of population centers. The message ended with coordinates where human officials should report for their new assignments under Imperial rule in the command center. Admiral Lisa Brennan listened to the alien message with a slight smile on her face. She looked at General Danny Pierce, who nodded once. The general walked to the main console and entered his authorization code. On the screen in front of him, a button appeared labeled Defense Grid Activation. He pressed it without hesitation. Across the solar system, 43,000 human warships received the activation signal simultaneously. Reactor cores that had been running at minimal power suddenly surged to full output. Weapon systems that had been in standby mode came fully online. Shield generators that had been dormant activated and created protective barriers around each vessel. Stealth systems that had kept the ships hidden for years suddenly deactivated. The Zetharian sensors went crazy. Admiral Korvex was reviewing targeting data when his tactical officer shouted in alarm. The sensor displays were showing impossible readings. Thousands of new contacts were appearing throughout the solar system. Energy signatures were spiking across all frequencies. The tactical computer was struggling to count and classify the new contacts. Within seconds, the count reached 10,000, then 20,000, then 30,000. The officer reported that 43,000 vessels had just appeared from nowhere, and every single one of them was broadcasting energy levels that exceeded anything in the Zetharian database. Confusion spread through the alien fleet. Ship commanders demanded explanations from their sensor operators. Tactical officers insisted their equipment must be malfunctioning. Admiral Korvex stared at his displays in disbelief. This was impossible. The scouts had spent 3 months watching Earth. They had reported no significant military presence. They had seen primitive spacecraft and crude weapons. Now suddenly there were 43,000 warships surrounding his fleet. The energy readings suggested technology far more advanced than anything the Zetharians possessed. This had to be a trick or a sensor malfunction or some kind of human deception. Emperor Vornthax was informed of the situation, and he immediately assumed it was a bluff. The humans had probably deployed decoys or sensor jammers to make their fleet appear larger than it was. He ordered Admiral Korvex to proceed with the attack as planned. The admiral hesitated, but he could not disobey a direct order from the Emperor. He commanded his weapons officers to lock onto their targets on Earth and prepare to fire on his mark. In the command center, President Helen Carter had arrived to witness what came next. She stood beside Admiral Brennan and General Pierce. The three of them watched the main holographic display showing the Zetharian fleet and the surrounding human vessels. Communications Officer Pete Morgan sat at his station ready to transmit Earth's official response. The president nodded to him, and he activated his microphone. His voice was calm and professional as he began the transmission that would be broadcast to the Zetharian fleet and recorded for history. Pete identified himself as speaking on behalf of the United Earth's government. He stated that the Zetharian declaration of war had been received and formally denied. Earth did not recognize the authority of the Zetharian Empire. Earth did not accept any terms of surrender. Earth would defend itself against all aggressors. The Zetharian fleet was ordered to reverse course immediately and leave the solar system. This was not a negotiation. This was a final warning. The Zetharian ships had exactly 30 seconds to begin their retreat. If they did not comply, Earth would interpret their presence as a continued act of war and would respond with appropriate force. Aboard the Zetharian flagship, the translation of the human message caused laughter to erupt on the bridge. The crew could not believe what they were hearing. These primitive creatures were threatening the Zetharian Empire. Admiral Corvex himself smiled at the audacity. Emperor Vornthax heard the message and considered it the most entertaining thing that had happened during the entire campaign. He ordered his admiral to teach the humans a lesson about the price of defiance. The weapons officer began the final countdown to fire on Earth cities. In the command center, a digital timer appeared on every screen counting down the 30 seconds. Jake Morrison watched his tactical display showing that the Zetharian weapons were charging. Kate Simmons listened to the alien communications and heard them laughing. Captain Ryan Wells aboard the Defiant near Neptune received his firing authorization and locked his weapons onto the Zetharian flagship. Across the solar system, every human warship did the same. 43,000 vessels each selected a target. Targeting computers calculated firing solutions. Antimatter torpedoes were loaded. Quantum lances were charged. Kinetic artillery was aimed. Nanite swarms were prepared for launch. The timer counted down. 30 seconds. 29. 28. The Zetharians continued moving toward Earth with their weapons hot. 20 seconds. 15. Admiral Corvex gave the order to fire on Earth's cities. The weapons officer pressed the firing sequence. 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2. Admiral Lisa Brennan spoke 2 words into her headset. Full offensive. Throughout the solar system, 43,000 human warships opened fire simultaneously. The space between Earth and the Zetharian fleet filled with light as weapons that had been developed in secret. 60 years were finally unleashed. The Zetharians were about to learn what humanity had been preparing for and why Earth's leaders had not been afraid. The age of human isolation was over, and the galaxy was about to discover that mankind was not. Pray, Captain Ryan Wells pressed the firing button on his command console and watched as the Defiant unleashed its first antimatter lance. The weapon traveled through space at nearly the speed of light, crossing the distance between Neptune and the Zetharian vanguard in 0.3 of a second. The lance was a focused beam of antimatter particles contained in a magnetic field. When it struck the shields of the Zethian flagship, the shields offered no resistance at all. The antimatter beam passed through the alien defensive barriers as if they were made of paper. It struck the hull of the massive warship, and the matter-antimatter reaction released energy equivalent to 100 nuclear bombs. The Zetharian flagship simply ceased to exist. One moment it was a 5-kilometer-long vessel carrying 3,000 crew members, including Admiral Corvex. The next moment there was nothing but a rapidly expanding cloud of superheated gas and debris. The Emperor's command ship, which had been positioned safely behind the flagship, suddenly found itself in the front line. Alarms began screaming throughout the vessel. Crew members scrambled to understand what had just happened. Emperor Vornthax demanded answers, but his officers had none to give. The human fleet decloaked completely, and the Zetharians finally saw what they were facing.
43,000
human warships, arranged in perfect geometric formations, surrounded the alien fleet on all sides. Each human vessel was broadcasting active targeting locks. The Zetharian computers registered that every single one of their ships was being targeted by multiple human weapons. Admiral Lisa Brennan spoke calmly into her headset from the command center on Earth. Her orders were clear and precise. Full offensive engagement. Priority targets were command vessels. Remaining ships were to be disabled and captured when possible. No mercy for those who continued fighting. Commander Jake Morrison coordinated the assault from his station. His job was to manage the flow of targeting data and ensure that human ships did not accidentally fire on each other in the chaos of battle. The coordination was flawless. Human tactical computers were networked together, sharing information in real time. Every captain knew exactly where every friendly ship was located. Every weapons officer knew which targets belonged to them. The months and years of training drills now paid off as the human fleet moved like a single organism. What happened next could not be called a battle because that word implied two sides fighting. This was an execution. Human weapons technology was 3 centuries ahead of anything the Zetharians possessed. The quantum torpedoes that human ships launched did not travel through normal space. They phased into a higher dimension and reappeared inside enemy vessels, bypassing shields and armor entirely. When they detonated, they released cascading quantum reactions that tore ships apart from the inside. Zetharian warships that had taken decades to build were reduced to scrap in seconds. The nanite swarms were even more terrifying. Human vessels launched clouds of microscopic machines that moved through space at high speed. When the swarms reached their targets, they attached themselves to the hull and began dismantling the ship molecule by molecule. The Zetharians watched in horror as their vessels were literally eaten away. Hull plates dissolved into dust. Internal systems were stripped down to raw materials. The nanites were programmed to avoid life support areas, so the crews survived, but they were trapped in the remains of their dying ships, unable to fight or flee. The kinetic artillery was perhaps the most brutal weapon in the human arsenal. These were solid projectiles made of dense metals accelerated to 95% of light speed using magnetic rail systems. When a kinetic round struck a Zetharian ship, the impact energy was equivalent to a small star. The target vessel did not explode or break apart. It simply stopped existing. The kinetic energy was so enormous that the matter of the ship was converted into plasma instantly. The shock wave from each impact damaged nearby vessels. The Zetharians had never imagined weapons of such destructive power. The Zetharian fleet tried to return fire, but their efforts were pathetic. Plasma cannons that could melt through most known materials struck human shields and dissipated harmlessly. The quantum shield technology created barriers that existed partially outside normal space. Energy weapons could not penetrate them. Kinetic weapons bounced off them. Even the Zetharian graviton torpedoes, which could crush most ships, were absorbed and redirected by the human shields. The Zetharians might as well have been throwing rocks at a mountain. Lieutenant Kate Simmons monitored the enemy communications from her station aboard the Defiant. The Zetharian chatter had changed dramatically. There was no more laughter. No more jokes about conquering Earth. Now, there were only screams and prayers and desperate calls for retreat. Ship commanders begged their superiors for orders. Crew members cried out to their gods. Some captains tried to surrender, but they did not know the proper human protocols. Others tried to flee, but the human ships were faster and blocked every escape route. Emperor Vornthax sat frozen on his throne as his empire's mighty fleet was torn apart around him. His tactical officers reported devastating losses. 200 ships destroyed in the first minute, 500 by the second minute, 1,000 by the fifth minute. The numbers kept climbing. His weapons officer reported that human shields were impenetrable. His science officer reported that human technology exceeded Zetharian capabilities by margins that should not be possible. His communications officer reported that 17 captains had already tried to surrender. On Earth in the command center, General Danny Pierce watched the tactical display with satisfaction. The battle plan was proceeding exactly as designed. Every simulation they had run over the years had predicted this outcome. The Zetharians had been chosen as the test case specifically because they were one of the strongest military powers in the galaxy. If humanity could defeat them this decisively, then no other civilization would dare threaten Earth. The message would be clear and undeniable. Captain Ryan Wells ordered his crew to switch targets. The Defiant had already destroyed 6 Zetharian warships. Now he directed his weapons at a cluster of enemy vessels that were trying to form a defensive formation. It was a futile effort. His quantum torpedoes phased through space and detonated inside the enemy ships. 3 more Zetharian vessels went dark as their power systems failed. His tactical officer reported that their weapons were offline and life support was minimal. Those ships could be recovered and their crews interrogated later. The entire engagement lasted 14 minutes from the first shot to the final ceasefire. In those 14 minutes, the Zetharian invasion force was completely destroyed as a fighting force. Of the 3,000 warships that had entered the solar system, only 400 remained intact. The rest were either debris fields or disabled hulks drifting in space. Not a single human vessel had been damaged. Not one human crew member had been injured. The shield systems had held perfectly. The weapons had performed beyond expectations. The tactical coordination had been flawless. Admiral Lisa Brennan gave the order to cease fire. The sudden silence was profound. Human ships held their positions surrounding the surviving Zetharian vessels. The alien ships were powered down with their weapons offline, and their shields collapsed. Their crews were alive but trapped. They had no way to escape and no way to fight. They could only wait to see what the humans would do next. Jake Morrison began receiving damage reports from the Zetharian fleet. The computers tallied the casualties automatically. Approximately 2 million Zetharian crew members had died in the engagement. Another 800,000 were trapped in disabled vessels. The numbers were staggering, but Jake felt no sympathy. These beings had come to conquer Earth. They had intended to destroy human cities and enslave humanity. They had gotten exactly what they deserved. Emperor Vornthax finally found his voice and ordered his communications officer to broadcast a surrender. The message went out on all frequencies. The Zetharian Empire surrendered unconditionally. They begged for mercy. They pleaded for the humans to spare the surviving crews. They offered tribute and territory and technology. The Emperor, who had ruled 400 civilizations, now groveled before a species he had thought primitive. His 1,000-year-old empire had been humbled in 14 minutes. President Helen Carter stood in the command center, listening to the alien surrender. She looked at Admiral Brennan and General Pierce. The three of them shared a moment of grim satisfaction. They had proven that humanity could defend itself. They had shown the galaxy that Earth was not defenseless. Now came the harder part. They had to decide what message to send to the rest of the civilizations out there. They had to make it clear that humanity wanted peace, but would respond to threats with overwhelming force. The age of humanity hiding in isolation was over, and the galaxy needed to understand the new rules. General Danny Pierce supervised the boarding operations. From the command center, as human, Marines secured the disabled Zetharian vessels. The Marines wore combat armor that made them look like mechanical demons with glowing visors and integrated weapon systems. They moved through the alien ships with ruthless efficiency, clearing compartments and securing crew members. The Zetharians offered no resistance. Most of them were in shock. They'd gone from confident conquerors to defeated prisoners in less than 15 minutes, and their minds could not process the reversal. The Marine teams found Emperor Vornthax hiding in his personal chambers, aboard what remained of his command ship. The great emperor who ruled 400 civilizations was discovered cowering behind his throne with 2 of his royal guards who had already dropped their weapons. The Marines secured him without incident and transported him to a human vessel for processing. Within an hour, the emperor was standing in a detention cell staring at walls made of materials he did not recognize. He had demanded to speak with human leadership, and his demand had been granted. President Helen Carter appeared before the emperor via holographic. She stood in the command center on Earth while her image materialized in front of the alien ruler. The emperor looked at her and began speaking in his own language, expecting translation systems to handle the communication. Helen held up one hand to stop him. She spoke in flawless Zetharian using grammar and dialect that indicated she had studied the language extensively. She told him that humanity had been listening to Zetharian communications for over 40 years. Humans understood his language better than most of his own citizens. The emperor was stunned into silence. Helen continued speaking. She explained that Earth had detected the first Zetharian transmissions in the 1980s. Human scientists had decoded the language within months. They had listened to Zetharian military communications and commercial broadcasts and entertainment programs. They had studied Zetharian culture and technology and military tactics. They knew everything about his empire. They had been watching and learning while the Zetharians remained completely ignorant of Earth's true nature. Dr. Amy Foster joined the holographic transmission. She appeared beside the president and began explaining the reality of human technological development. She told the emperor that humanity was not a young species just beginning to explore space. Humans had developed faster than light travel 200 years ago. They had colonized several planets and moons within their own solar system. They had built weapons and ships that could challenge any force in the galaxy. The primitive rockets and satellites that the Zetharian scouts had observed were deliberate deceptions. Humanity had chosen isolation and had created an elaborate facade to make themselves appear weak and backwards. Amy, explained that Earth's policy had been to watch and learn from other civilizations without revealing themselves. Humanity had deployed thousands of stealth monitoring stations across the galaxy over the past century. These stations had observed hundreds of different species. Humans had studied alien technology and copied what was useful and improved upon it. The quantum shields that had made human vessels invulnerable were based on Krellian science enhanced with human modifications. The antimatter weapons were derived from Taldorian designs, but were 10 times more powerful. The nanite swarms were entirely human inventions that no other species had conceived. Emperor
X
listened to all of this with growing horror. He finally understood the magnitude of his mistake. He had attacked the most technologically advanced civilization in the known galaxy. He had threatened a species that had been secretly observing his empire for decades. He had brought 3,000 ships to conquer a world that could have destroyed his entire empire if they had chosen to do so. His voice shook as he asked why humanity had hidden for so long. Why had they not announced themselves to the galaxy? Why had they allowed other species to believe they were alone? President Carter's expression was cold as she answered. She said that humanity had watched the galaxy and had not liked what they saw. To man, why civilizations were aggressive and expansionist? Too many species believed that might made right. The Zetharian Empire itself had conquered 97 civilizations. Humanity had watched those conquests happen. They had listened to the screams of the defeated. They had recorded the atrocities committed in the name of imperial expansion. They had decided that the galaxy was not ready for human contact. So they had remained hidden and had prepared themselves for the day when someone inevitably discovered Earth, decided to attack. Helen told the Emperor that he had done humanity a favor by attacking. His invasion had given Earth the perfect opportunity to reveal themselves and demonstrate their capabilities. The defeat of the Zetharian fleet would send a message to every civilization in the galaxy. That message was simple and clear. Earth was off limits. Humanity wanted to be left alone. Any species that threatened Earth would face the same fate as the Zetharians. The demonstration had been necessary, and the Emperor's fleet had been chosen, specifically because they were strong enough to make the point convincing. Captain Ryan Wells was given the honor of delivering Earth's official ultimatum to the Galactic Council. The council consisted of representatives from over 600 civilizations. They gathered virtually in a shared holographic space. Ryan appeared before them wearing his uniform and standing at attention. Behind him, holographic displays showed footage from the battle. The council members watched in silence as human weapons tore through Zetharian ships. They saw the 14-minute countdown. They witnessed the complete destruction of a fleet that many of them had feared. Ryan spoke clearly and without emotion. He declared that Earth was establishing a territorial boundary, extending 50 light-years in all directions from Sol. This sphere of space was now human territory. Any vessel entering this space without explicit permission from Earth's authorities would be considered hostile. It would be destroyed without warning. There would be no second chances. There would be no negotiations. The boundary was absolute. He stated that humanity had no interest in conquest or expansion. They did not want to join the Galactic Council. They did not want trade agreements or cultural exchanges. They wanted privacy, and they would enforce that privacy with overwhelming force if necessary. To emphasize the point, Commander Jake Morrison activated what Human Command was calling the Revelation Protocol. Across the galaxy and hundreds of star systems hidden, human monitoring stations received the signal and deactivated their stealth systems simultaneously. Automated beacons began broadcasting on all frequencies. Within minutes, every major civilization detected the signals. The stations had been there for decades, watching and listening. Some were in orbit around alien homeworlds. Others were positioned near major trade routes. A few were actually inside the territory of aggressive empires. The message was clear and terrifying. Humanity had been watching everyone for a very long time. They had the capability to strike any target in the galaxy within hours. They possessed weapons that could destroy planets if they chose to use them. They had remained hidden not out of fear, but out of choice. Now that choice was over. The galaxy would know that Earth existed, and would understand that Earth was not to be disturbed. The Galactic Council erupted in chaos. Representatives demanded explanations. Some accused humanity of spying and violating territorial sovereignty. Others begged for mercy and promised they had never intended to threaten Earth. A few tried to negotiate for technology sharing or defensive alliances. Admiral Lisa Brennan responded to all of them with the same statement. Humanity was not interested in galactic politics. The monitoring stations would remain in place. Earth would continue to observe. Any civilization that had peaceful intentions had nothing to fear. Any civilization that considered aggression against Earth or against human interests would be eliminated. The Zetharian Empire sued for peace immediately. The Emperor signed a treaty that acknowledged Earth's territorial claims and promised eternal non-aggression. The surviving Zetharian crews were returned to their space aboard their disabled vessels. Human engineers had permanently deactivated the weapon systems using nanites that could not be removed or reversed. The ships could still fly, but they could never fight again. Each vessel carried encoded into its computer core a message that would broadcast automatically to any ship that came near. The message told the story of what happened when the Zetharians attacked Earth. It served as a warning to every species in the galaxy. Other civilizations rushed to send diplomatic missions to Earth. They all carried the same message. They had never intended hostility. They wanted peaceful relations. They hoped humanity would consider opening limited communications. President Carter rejected most of these offers. She accepted messages from a few civilizations that human intelligence had identified as genuinely peaceful. To the rest, she sent a simple response. Earth would continue to monitor the galaxy. Humanity would judge other species by their actions, not their words. Those who proved themselves worthy might someday be contacted. Those who proved themselves dangerous would be dealt with accordingly. The story concluded with President Helen Carter standing at the window of her office in Washington, looking up at the night sky. The stars looked the same as they always had, but now humanity knew they were not alone. Commander Jake Morrison entered the office and reported that all human vessels had returned to their hidden positions. The stealth systems were reactivated. The fleet was once again invisible. On Earth, the public was celebrating. The news showed footage of the disabled Zetharian ships being escorted out of the solar system. People were calling it a miracle. They believed their military had somehow pulled off an impossible victory with primitive technology and determination. The truth about humanity's real capabilities remained classified at the highest levels. Only a few thousand people knew the full extent of Earth's technology and military power. The general public was told that Earth's scientists had made several breakthrough discoveries during the crisis that had allowed them to defend the planet. The story was plausible enough, and most people accepted it. They were simply happy to be alive and safe. The governments of Earth had agreed that the full truth would remain secret. The facade of a young civilization would continue for the public even though the galaxy now knew better. Jake stood beside the president and asked if she thought the aliens would leave Earth alone now. Helen was quiet for a moment before answering. She said that the demonstration had been convincing and that most civilizations would respect the boundary. There would always be a few who tested the limits or who believed they could succeed where the Zetharians failed. When that happened, humanity would be ready. The fleet would remain hidden and vigilant. The monitoring stations would continue watching. Earth would maintain its policy of isolation. Backed by the threat of overwhelming force, she turned from the window and smiled slightly. She told Jake that humanity had spent 10,000 years fighting each other. They had built empires and waged wars and developed terrible weapons. Now, for the first time in history, all of humanity was united with a common purpose. They had a reason to work together and a frontier to defend. The Zetharians had intended to conquer Earth, but instead they had given humanity something precious. They had given them a place in the galaxy and a reason to stand together. Jake smiled back and agreed. The future was uncertain, but humanity would face it as they always had. With determination and ingenuity and an unwillingness to back down from any challenge,